This is Sunday Interview in Sweaters.
Hi, and welcome back to the committee program. I'm your host, Arun Chaudhary, and on today's Sunday Interviews in Sweaters, we have a dear friend of mine, Kerric Harvey, who is a professor at the George Washington University, and who I have deep and important conversations about communications and its relationship to fiction, especially. One of the few people who will tolerate these conversations. And in fact, the last time we spent time together was actually for a play that you had written that was performed on public radio that we were able to talk about, which was sort of almost in real time play about the events of January the 6th and the reflection in the media. Similarly, we had a conversation that I wanted to expand upon with you because I think it's something we've been talking about on the show a lot. And that has to do with law enforcement communications. And we had been talking about, and then I will be quiet and you can recollect that we did indeed talk about it and say hello to everyone. But we had been talking about sort of how law enforcement and access and kind of this harmonious relationship between the culture industry and the law enforcement community not only has sort of put a lock on the messaging about what law enforcement is and does, but also kind of shifted to the side some previous, maybe more countercultural narratives we had, kind of starting from the highwaymen leading up to the private investigator, to Sam Spade, to, people who could live in this world. And I'll back up a bit, but just say hello to everyone and hi. And
hi,
it's just
everyone.
So great to see you.
It's so great to be here. And Arun, it's so, as always, so wonderful to see you too. It really is. And I'm so glad you wanted to go back and talk about some of this stuff because it's interesting, I think, in both forward-facing and backwards-facing directions. It's where we came from in the popular culture to get to where we are in real life society. It's looking at entertainment programming almost as an archaeological relic that lets us, if we can only decode that, it then gives us insight into the present day landscape. And that's, God knows we need as much of that as we possibly can get. So I'm thrilled that you want to chat about this some more.
Yeah, and just, it always comes back to sort of these 20th century figures who still dominate our kind of cultural landscape just because this is, the beginning of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. But, I think it is the rise of radio and the rise of J. Edgar Hoover are not coincidentally at the same time. And I think, even as I think we'll expand this conversation and bring in scholars of communication and bring in some historians and folks from who study judicial justice, but it seems pretty clear that he had a good idea, and that's we know the stories, we have access to the criminals, we have access to the cops. If you want to tell good stories, we can provide you with this. I mean, this continues today.
Absolutely, and it continues today, both in terms of entertainment and genre entertainment in particular. We'll come back to that in a second maybe, but also in terms of everything, all kinds of political communication, whether it is campaign rhetoric, whether it is putting together news headlines, which is not supposed to be political communication, but which is, whether it is advertising for cultural products that then relocate the purchaser in a different place within sort of the societal pecking order. I'm thinking, of course, of the things like makeup and fast cars and expensive clothes, but you could also extend that to to what websites you look at, to what kinds and amounts of firearms you buy. I mean, it is the lines between the membranes between anything to do with culture and anything to do with politics, anything to do with communications, and anything to do with consumerism. Those four different sets of categories have really all kind of blended together. And I think that's probably because we're at the intersection of technology, a big shift in technology, and an even bigger shift in how politics and culture inform and counter-inform each other. And some of that's been deliberate. Some of that's been deliberate, and people have talked about that a lot in the public sphere. I remember very clearly the first time I saw a high-level political operative's book in, I think it was Kramer Books and Afterwards bookstore here in D.C. in the front window, in a display that is usually reserved for fiction. And it was Peggy Noonan's book about the being part of the Reagan presidency. That was a shift, moving from politics into something close to entertainment. And what you're talking about with J. Edgar Hoover, which is absolutely incandescent as an insight, is kind of going the other way. It's moving from real life into seizing the frame within which entertainment programming about that aspect of real life then takes place. And if you can command the narrative, you can command the perception. So for J. Edgar Hoover to say, oh, there's this new interest in police shows and enforcement shows, in anything to do with defending the nation, both inside and outside of national boundaries, let's make it easy for them, for the people who otherwise might be our critics, by bringing them into our circle of special access. Not only will they then feel sort of, if not indebted to us, but part of us at somewhat level, but we will get to supply to them things that they need and things that they think they need, and thus get to turn off the spigot for things that they don't know about and we don't want them to have. So it's that, again, it's that seizing the mic, that grabbing the frame, that the narrative frame that melted some of those boundaries, going in the direction from the real world into entertainment, and into the cop show genre.
And I think, yeah, the cop show genre, which stays with us not just because of this reason, but for something else, or I think that J. Edgar Hoover had insight into, which is this idea of the emotional satisfaction of watching process. And sort of, it's why cooking shows, police procedurals, all these things are so sort of can be so popular, is this feeling of watching process. And that at the heart of that is, am I getting the authentic stuff, right? Are the Grey's Anatomy's doctors actually dripping out real operation words, right? I want to think that they are. Do even the Star Trek jargon hang together? I'm going to buy a guidebook to make sure that it does. And so I think this knowing, people are sort of even willing to hang up a lot of even what they know, how the story might be then changed to help the cops. But who cares? The gun is now the real gun, and somehow that's like the real thing, and the car is the real car. And so the people are sort of willing to sacrifice a lot for this idea that the process is
and
right.
The process is, and I think you're 100% accurate with that. And we see that over and over again in different types of shows that are based on alternative worlds that have to be built through that kind of process. So think about Game of Thrones and the whole Harry Potter thing. When you mentioned Star Trek, it used to just be confined to science fiction, where people got to see the process by which a whole civilization rolled itself out. And part of being in that audience was, just like you say, also kind of knowing the inside scoop, knowing the words to use, knowing the expectations, knowing that this kind of spell is dangerous to use in a full moon, that kind of spell is fine to use at any time. There's a real thirst for that. And we see that go back to before the law enforcement and the police show stuff. We also see that go back to crime, the American fascination with how the mafia works. It's a subculture with a code of honor, with everybody knows their place, but there's room for ambition and movement. There's specialized equipment and specialized language, and relationships are complicated but dynamic. They may terrify you, but they're certainly not going to bore you to death. And all of these things that you're talking about, that we're talking about, are ways for people to step outside the process of their own lives that have become so familiar that they risk being not just boring but kind of stultifying, and kind of being armchair ethnographers into some other more exciting place. Now, when you attach that to what, I never thought about it this way, but when you attach that to what J. Edgar Hoover was doing, you've kind of got a double payoff going on for people, because not only is it the satisfaction of watching process play out, and watching process play out in a way that is an exoticized version, a slice of your world that gets blown up, even if it's just your world in the imagination, that gets blown up into a whole created culture, but all of that is attached to power. All of that is attached to the wielding of power, to the reining in of power. We've got power. You're a criminal. You shouldn't have power. To the distribution of power. To the the ultimate.
Or you're a criminal type.
Right.
You
Unless
shouldn't
we
have
elect
power.
So you're a criminal type, so you shouldn't have power unless we elect you, and then you're somehow not sanctified, but you're somehow accredited with the right to use that power that if you were just a normal person would have had you in jail by now. So it's this really strange, complicated, but incredibly rich thing that's happening here, and I love how you're talking about some of the classics, some of the old and the historical versions of these kinds of shows, because for one thing, that's what I mean by it's backward facing and forward. It's a Janus thing. It's backward facing and forward facing at the same time in its terms of its importance. But it also makes me think about. At first, I thought this is probably a uniquely American phenomenon, but it listening to you talk, it really is anything but. But ethnographically, it's fascinating to look at what categories of character inhabit these different types of enforcement shows, cop shows. So, for instance, if you look at what the British put on, they love their police, their private detectives, their unwilling one-off sworn-in sheriff type people, but mostly their private detectives. They love them to be religious figures as well. They love them to be vicars. They're all. Yes. How many vicars do you see running after criminals? Right. And often they're not people who fit the cultural stereotype of body height to weight ratio. They're more like everyday people, but they're vicars or they're ministers or they're priests. If they're not that, then they're deeply damaged people. We do that too in the United States. They're starting with Sherlock Holmes. They have drug addictions, right? That again would have if they weren't chasing criminals with if they weren't chasing criminals who help bring drug addiction, let me start that again. I'm so excited. If they weren't chasing criminals who help bring drug addictions into play for so many people, these private investigators' drug addictions of their own would make them criminals. It's this alchemical effect that is just phenomenal. So the British like vicars. Both the British and the Americans occasionally like psychics. And what do you do with that? What do you do with people who speak to the dead, spend time in the beyond, are surprised when they open the refrigerator to find things there that belonged to people who died long ago and far away and they haven't seen since before then, but suddenly Igor's shaky. Igor's health drink has manifested inside my refrigerator 10 years after he's dead. I mean, what I can only begin to start taking apart what that means culturally, right? That it's just screaming, deconstruct me.
Yeah, and maybe it's sort of searching for ambiguity in here, both scientific and moral ambiguity, because of what's been lost by the J. Edgar Hoovers of the world, right? That maybe in, providing this extra great process, we are also, as you said, defining power in an extremely clear and clarion way, in black and white. While the private detective and all these things did enjoy this gray area, I'm helping someone despite them being a criminal, despite them maybe even being morally suspect as well as judicially suspect. I am maybe exposing the police for being judicially suspect. These kinds of things that don't happen anymore. I mean, what do you think the effects are of sort of washing this out? What we must, as much as we enjoy the process, we must look for the transgression someplace, right? I mean, that also seems like it would be in us.
I think so. I would hope so. To kind of get to that point, which is a really crucial point, I want to linger for a minute and hear you linger too on this division between private detectives and police in terms of who is kind of the enforcement agent of choice right now, of audience choice right now. And there was a point, not so long after the Second World War, really, where that started to shift from the cop as hero to the private detective as damaged hero. And for one thing about that, of course, is private detectives aren't bound by the same institutional laws and codes and rules that police are. And so that says something about, I don't know, a contemporary need to operate outside structure, possibly outside of law, even while enforcing law. Some deep self-contradiction, not even a paradox, some deep self-contradiction in that psyche. But another thing that being a private detective does is it lets you play it both ways. You can play both sides. You can be just a regular person, and you can be an agent of the state, even though you don't owe anything to the state. You're not official with the state. You get access, you kind of let into the locker room, so to speak, in law enforcement. You know, the cops know you, they give you tips, you give them tips, you have an uneasy working relationship.
There's sometimes a grudging respect, right? That's sort of at the heart of maybe the humor of a lot of these things.
The grudging respect, that's absolute. We could do an entire book on this called Grudging Respect. But then the other thing, so there's that ambiguity that you were talking about that plays out. But then the other thing is, when you're a private detective instead of a police officer, is you get to decide when you're going to actually bring somebody in and when you're not. There's room for ambiguity at the level of individual agency.
Personal expression.
Yes, personal expression. Like, you know, I know that you just, you know, blew up all those buildings and ran all those drugs and did all that awful stuff, but I really think you have it in you to reform. And so if I put you in the prison system, we know it's only going to get worse. So I'm going to make a moral choice above the ethical code of my profession, because I'm not a cop, because I'm a private detective. And so I get a chance to do that. And I'm going to give you a second chance. Whereas if I were a cop, I have to bring you in. So it really the private detective, by being less than a cop institutionally, kind of gets to be more than a cop in terms of their own self-expression, their own morality, you know, and power. Then they
less than a cop institutionally is so true, because like, how much do they bake into the cake of all of these guys exactly what their expenses are, 10 cents a day, you know, like it really sounds like this horrible wage work, right? Well, you sort of, in a cop show, you never, you know, we assume that they get paid regularly on time and envelopes that go directly to the bank. Like, it's probably all very, like, you know, they're enjoying a socialism the rest of us could dream of.
And
it's such an emphasis.
Such an emphasis. And you know, that's another thing is, I mean, that maybe crosses another strand of how people measure themselves against each other, which is, how much money do you make? I mean, that's everybody from Alexis de Tocqueville to, I don't know, Trevor Noah, really. Everybody smart along that continuum of incredibly smart has commented on the American habit of substituting income level for any other criteria of worth, both for individuals and for groups. So that would then be kind of something that props up the basic, you know, just plain social power you have of being liminal, of being kind of a cop but not a cop. The flip side of that, you get more power because you get to decide things that are outside the rules, but you have less stability because you're not on payroll. So you got to make up for that somehow. But then the other thing I want to get to that came at the end of our discussion with that class was how journalism enters into all of this. And I can't help but, I've thought about it a little bit since, I can't help but feel like there's actually an archetype under the archetype, an even deeper archetype, in terms of explaining not just the enjoyment but the fascination with this particular genre. And that's the idea of the renegade or the vigilante, that the people you really put your faith in are people who have no faith in anything else. The people you can trust are people who are outside any kind of organization or any kind of institution. They go it alone. And so you can almost see that movement, that transference, getting less institutional and more vigilante as these genres move through broadcasting history. So So you start with with cop shows, cops as the good guys, unequivocally be good guys. Then you kind of have the shadow version of that with a whole chapter of film noir after the war, and maybe 10, 20 years after that, the whole Godfather series, the whole mafia organized crime series.
Mm-hmm.
And then you move into all of these vicars and psychics, and sometimes veterinarians get pulled into it. People who don't really want to be private investigators, but they end up being so.
Reluctant heroes,
again, another
yeah.
trope, reluctant heroes. But then you move into, at some point, probably around Watergate, there is this transference from private, everything that was the styling, the detailing, the clothing, the coat of many colors for a private detective that is more tattered but more interesting than the uniform coat of an actual police officer. That wardrobe got hijacked for journalism, and
Totally.
journalists
Totally, right? The actual stitching.
And journalists became the vigilantes. They became the place that was going to hold the group that was going to hold everybody else to account, totally bypassing the bedrock reality that they work in a commercial industry. They work.
Increasingly centralizing even as this thing is happening, right? As this change is happening.
Even as it's happening. They work for a corporation.
This ain't 10 cents a day plus expenses.
Right.
Yeah.
And by 1099 form, because they work for big business. All of the main, whether you're talking about something that started out like BuzzFeed, whether you're talking about like a social media aggregator station that gets bought up by a bigger social media fish, whether you're talking about legacy media that just keeps chewing each other up, that the cannibalistic nature of the political economy of the news media is just mind-blowing. It's always been a little bit that way, but man, we are talk about Hunger Games at this point. And the more it centralizes, the more commercial it is, the more institutional it is. And the minute something is an institution, it has two jobs. One job is protecting itself as an institution, its own longevity. And then the second job is whatever it was created to do in the first place. And it's always in that order of priority. So journalists are probably the least desirable people, if anybody's desirable, to be a vigilante in this whole lineup. But they're the ones who occupy that space now. And it's through this morphing of sometimes overlapping, but basically this morphing from cop show to private detective to borderline kind of hard drinking, drug taking, self-destructive private detective. Bogart gave us a few glimpses into how that was going to, should I say, blossom, how that was going to come to pass, but it's nothing like, Kate Winslet's series, the mayor of I think it's Eastham, that's going to be sweeping awards this year, and she's doing a fabulous job in it. But as a genre, it just keeps downshifting, really. And here's, when you said, we were talking just before this about somehow it's different to have the journalists in that job than even private detectives. Part of it is that the stakes are, for me, that the stakes are so uneven. If you're a private detective, if you're a cop, if you're a damaged private detective, you're still out there at some point in a deserted warehouse in the dark or on the street. You're still in a place where people who are dangerous, to whom you are trying to be dangerous, can turn that around and hurt you. If you're a journalist, you might put yourself in, I'm talking in domestic now, not war correspondence. Not international. Yeah. If you're a journalist of the kind of, the way most journalists are, you may be breaking stories where you are putting yourself at some degree of risk, but it's not the same kind of everyday will I come home tonight risk that a beat cop has, or Sherlock Holmes, teetering on the edge of a high plateau with the smartest guy in the world,
No, and frankly, I want to break down the wall you've set up and say I think almost a logical conclusion of what we're talking about is what I just saw a few minutes ago, be push headline on my phone, which is follow along as New York Times journalists are embedded with troops in Ukraine, right? It's for a little bit of access, you can write breathlessly about something like war. We saw Brian Williams waxing poetic, right? It's sort of, the idea of the adventure and getting to be the person sort of overrides even a sense of judgment about it.
I couldn't agree more. And the whole idea of embedding as a good thing in war correspondence is so deeply wrong. I've never understood it, and I understand it even less now. Like you said, for just a little bit of access, you're gonna exchange your independent perspective.
The entire filter, through which you view the world, basically.
It's like a sellout without any money changing hands. I mean, I know that people need to do that, but they can do it differently. Look at what happened. Look how people fought their way onto the landing craft for D-Day. They weren't embedded, but they were there. There is an alternative. There are alternatives.
That's right.
But
this is such a rich subject. We have to come back to this soon. We are running out of time, and I do also, like I told you before, I'm going to invite other folks into this conversation. We got to take this apart by race and class and gender, because when you think about who the criminals are, right? There's an awful lot of kind of white criminals on the radio and et cetera, in a way that doesn't reflect in the jails at the same time. And so I think there's a lot of tensions here that are incredibly interesting, and people sort of trying to paint a picture of a country, of law enforcement, and of themselves. But thank you, Kerric Harvey. Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you so much for being a friend and always being good for a great talk.
Thank you. I feel exactly the same way. I look forward to more of these and to hearing what other people have to say. It's a great topic and an important one.